Next, from the Illinois Channel Archives, we offer an encore presentation of our 2004 interview with historian and author Richard Norton Smith, as he talks about his biography of Robert McCormick called The Colonel. At the time of this 2004 interview, Mr. Smith was the executive director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. This runs about 50 minutes.
Hi, I'm Terry Martin. This is the second installment of Illinois Books and Authors, and our book today is called The Colonel, The Life and Times of Robert McCormick, and our author is Richard Norton Smith. Thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
My pleasure.
Who was Robert McCormick?
Robert McCormick was many men. Robert McCormick was, at the beginning of the 20th century, an aspiring politician in Chicago. He had a distinguished lineage. His grandfather, Joseph Medill, friend of Abraham Lincoln, and was the city's mayor after the fire of 1871. It was Joseph Medill who really is synonymous with the early days of the Chicago Tribune. The Tribune was very much a family enterprise. But the Colonel had a brother named Joseph Medill McCormick, who was clearly being groomed to take over the newspaper. And so he was, there was the heir and the spare. He was the spare. So he went into politics, was a city councilor, an alderman, president of the sanitary district in his mid-20s. Everyone thought he was going to be governor of Illinois. And then his brother Medill had a couple nervous breakdowns, which if you know anything about his family, and particularly his mother, the original shrew, is not surprising. And the Colonel used to say as an adult, all the McCormicks are crazy except me, and some people wouldn't accept the qualification. So, and he had a point there. So anyway, he was, along with his cousin, Joe Medill Patterson, brought in to run the newspaper on this crazy quilt scheme. Joe Patterson was a socialist. The Colonel at that time was a bull moose progressive, later in life, what we would call a right-wing Republican. And every month they would alternate editorial control. And the newspaper would veer like a drunken sailor from left to right and back again. But they built a great newspaper. And eventually, Joe Medill went off to New York to create the New York Daily News, the nation's first tabloid, with Tribune money. Bertie McCormick stayed behind. He went and fought in World War I, had a distinguished, if brief, and characteristically controversial career as an artilleryman. Before that, he had been the only American correspondent to accompany the Russian army on the Eastern Front in World War I. In the 1920s, he took on Big Bill Thompson, a corrupt Republican mayor of Chicago, along with Al Capone and cronies. He really blossomed, I guess you could say, in the 1930s when his old Groton schoolmate Franklin Roosevelt was in the White House, and after a brief flirtation, they became mortal enemies, to the point where the Tribune printed, the FDR decided the Tribune needed a competitor. So he put Marshall Field up with something called the Chicago Sun. And on the very morning the sun rose for the first time, it was immediately eclipsed by the Tribune, which chose that day to print the Army's secret war plan, which I contend in the book had actually been, in a very Machiavellian way, slipped to the Colonel by those around Roosevelt, who knew what a wonderful target he would be. A few months later, following the Battle of Midway, the Tribune inadvertently revealed that we had broken the Japanese codes, and FDR was so angry that he wanted to send Marines in to shut down Tribune Tower. He was eventually dissuaded, and in lieu of that, a grand jury was convened by the Attorney General of the United States to indict the paper's managing editor. That prosecution fell apart when the Navy wouldn't reveal, even to the grand jury, that we had indeed broken the Japanese code. McCormick and FDR remained bitter enemies, not just rivals, right up to the day of Roosevelt's death and beyond. On April 12, 1945, McCormick was informed late that afternoon that the president had died. He went around Tribune Tower handing out $10 bills, saying this was a great day for America. And yet, he's such a paradoxical figure, in some ways nonsensical figure. That afternoon he took a call from his second wife, Marilyn, at their estate in Wheaton called Cantini. They had a dinner party that night, and she wanted to know if they should cancel the dinner party. And he said, no, we'll go ahead with the dinner party, but we'll drink we'll drink champagne instead of Montrachet. And then she said, Bertie, what about the flag outside the library? Everyone's lowering their flag. And he said, there's no one I'd rather lower my flag for. And so he lived on another decade, became an increasing anachronism in some ways, and in other ways a pioneer. He was both a visionary and anachronism. Radio. The Tribune, of course, was the world's greatest newspaper. Well, that's where radio station WGN, and later in 1948, television station WGN come into the picture. He hated Harry Truman as much as he hated Franklin Roosevelt, and of course, anyone who's ever seen the picture will never forget the famous Dewey defeats Truman headline of, what else, the Chicago Tribune in November 1948. He lived on unhappily, at odds with his times, even though there was at last a Republican of sorts in the White House. He didn't think of Dwight Eisenhower as being a real Republican. And he died, fittingly enough, on April Fool's Day in 1955, at the age of 74.
We were just talking off camera before we started. It'll be 50 years next year that
That's right.
he passed, and yet here is one of the leading figures of the 20th century, or certainly the first half of it, with tremendous influence. And yet today, even in Chicago, many people don't know who he was.
Well, it's ironic. It tells you something about the news cycle, which is sped up, and in some ways the historical cycle has done the same. For 30 to 40 years, he was a household name. Not only in Chicago, but Chicagoland. He invented the name, Chicagoland. It was a much catchier name than Zone 6, which was the original newspaper term for this geographical area that could be reached by a train from Chicago in a certain amount of time. And the colonel, who had a genius for marketing, including himself, thought Chicagoland. And to him, Chicagoland was more than a marketing tool. It was an empire. It was the real America. He used to, with some exceptions. He said that Wisconsin was the nuttiest state in the Union, except for California. He used to refer to, in the news stories, not the editorial columns. Madison, Wisconsin, was always referred to as New Leningrad, which gives you some idea of his politics. But to him, the real America was half a dozen states in the American Midwest, the old Northwest Territory, if you will. He, as a young man during World War I, he co-wrote a novel, which I think is very revealing of the man in many ways. And in the novel, the Germans invaded the United States on the East Coast and had no difficulty subduing it. The Japanese invaded the West Coast, had no difficulty. Only the true redoubt of Americanism, the great Middle West, held out. And that gives you an idea of the colonel's worldview. Remember, for many, many years, in addition to the catchphrase, the world's greatest newspaper, there was always an American flag on the masthead of the Tribune, and for many years, the slogan, an American newspaper for Americans. Well, that was not only a geographical concept, but it was a cultural and to some degree ideological concept. And it wasn't just Democrats and Republicans. He used to say about Tom Dewey, he's not an American, he's a New Yorker. For years, the Tribune's New York bureau was referred to as a foreign bureau. So the colonel, as a boy, went to Groton School in Massachusetts. He was the only student there from west of the Hudson, and he was made to feel very much an outlander. And I think that was one of the factors that contributed to his later detestation of the East, the effete East. He used to refer to the State Department as a bunch of he-debutantes. He, in 1932, conducted a contest to select a new capital for the United States because Washington, D.C. was anything but representative, a view that many Americans hold today. And, of course, Chicago wouldn't work because there were too many Democrats. But so they finally decided the perfect place for the capital of the United States was Grand Rapids, Michigan. Never happened.
We've covered a lot of territory there. Just let me briefly say this book is about 500 pages long. It's a tremendous history that starts roughly back in the 1840s, and the names you will find here in the family, the Medills, the
Yes.
McCormicks, and the Pattersons.
Yeah. What FDR used to refer to as the McCormick-Patterson axis during World War II. because newspapering runs in the family. And you're right, it begins with Joseph Medill, who did not invent the Chicago Tribune. A lot of people think he was its founder, but he created the newspaper in the modern sense. And he made it a great instrument of personal opinion. You have to remember that for a long time in this country, people read newspapers not for their objectivity, but for their personality. It wasn't just the editorial page to which they were drawn, although that was a factor. They were drawn to newspapers that had a very distinct character. And that character flavored the news columns, entertainment news. I mean, before television, before radio, this was the medium of public communication. And the genius of McCormick and Patterson was that they created a newspaper that everyone wanted to read, including, sometimes most of all, the people who took the most violent exception to its politics. I mean, the great paradox about the Tribune is that it was as dominant in Chicagoland, and particularly in the city of Chicago, as the Democratic Party was in Chicago politics. There's an enormous gulf there. And what bridges it was, the Tribune was compulsively readable. It had great sports coverage, great entertainment news, great women's news, and for a newspaper that disdained the rest of the world, it had one of the most impressive global networks of correspondence. I mean, the Colonel fired more distinguished correspondents than most papers hired. William L. Shirer, for example, and there were others as well. So the Tribune was part of daily life in Chicago for a long time. It was an inescapable part, the warp and woof of being a Chicagoan, in a way that no newspaper is today. Not because newspapers today...
Because of the advent of television and just the other media sources?
I think so. And also, newspapers today, there's no doubt that today's Tribune is infinitely more reliable, more credible.
What would McCormick think of today's Tribune?
I don't think he'd like it very much. I mean, it's a dangerous question, because he did understand. He said, not long before he died, he went outside and he stood beside the tower and he knocked on it. He said, this will stay the way I left it for about 10 years. He understood how finite is the life of any institution. He, of course, also was responsible for the Tribune Tower, the world's most beautiful office building, as it was modestly phrased. And his office was of a piece on the 24th floor, straight out of Mussolini. The Colonel was 6'5".
I was going to say, although some of the architects didn't find it that
No, I mean, it
beautiful
was Gothic. And then, of course, when you walk down Michigan Avenue today and you look at the tower, you'll see all these stones from all over the world, the Parthenon and the pyramids and the Vatican.
Whose idea was to put those in?
That was the Colonel's idea. And it was great. It was great publicity.
And you see today,
and he had his
people
foreign
will go by and
correspondence.
touch
Exactly.
the walls and
Precisely. But it was all of a piece as well with the idea that Chicago was the greatest city in the world. I mean, he was the ultimate booster. He named all 3 airports in Chicago.
Is that right?
Yeah. He was a great aviation buff in the 1920s. He set out to single-handedly, he was going to get rid of the East Coast. He was going to let New York wither on the vine. Chicago was going to be the center of international aviation. And one of his stunts was an over-the-pole route from Chicago to Europe. And he sent several planes off on that mission. He named all 3 airports, Meigs, Midway, and O'Hare. And the interesting story about O'Hare was, originally, it was supposed to be named for his World War I friend, later rival, General George C. Marshall, until someone pointed out that would make it Marshall Field. And the Colonel had no desire to promote his bitter rival at the Chicago Sun. So they found a rather obscure, if deserving, war hero named Butch O'Hare. And the Colonel, that's clout. I mean, the Colonel could almost single-handedly do that. He created Meigs because he was too impatient. Cantini, his estate, is out in Wheaton. And he had the world's only khaki-colored Rolls Royce. He loved all things military. But he was too impatient to ride all the way over Roosevelt Road to downtown Chicago every day. So he bought a plane, and he had a little airstrip created out back of the house, and he would fly in and out of Chicago every day. And so Meigsfield was created, really, so the colonel would have ready access to Tribune Tower.
One of his other members of his family was Cyrus McCormick.
That's right.
And what did Cyrus do of note?
Well, Cyrus claimed to have invented the Reaper. Now, the McCormicks all hate the Medills, and many McCormicks hate other McCormicks. And indeed, the colonel...
I was going to say they were a warring
They were.
family.
The Scotch, yeah, exactly, yeah. And the colonel and his mother, who was, as I say, a real character right out of Shakespeare, took delight for years in denying that Cyrus McCormick, in fact, had invented the Reaper. And the great irony was that it was a niece of Cyrus, or rather a nephew of Cyrus, who married Joseph Medill's daughter. So you had these two families, the Medills and the McCormicks, that were at war, and then they get married. And the war goes on, really, generation after generation, internalized. Because then you have these two sisters, Kate McCormick and her sister...
Sissy?
No, Nellie Patterson.
Right.
And there's a race to produce an heir who will take over from father, Joseph Medill. So Kate had Joseph Medill McCormick a few months ahead of Nellie had Joseph Medill Patterson. And the race was on, and of course that left Bertie, Robert Rutherford McCormick, out in the cold until, as I say, fate intervened, and he and his unlikely cousin, Joe, became co-proprietors of the Tribune.
Well, and part of the irony is that the colonel, Robert McCormick, wanted to have a career in politics and had started off with a career in politics.
Absolutely.
His brother Medill, Joe Medill, went by Medill.
Yeah.
Was running the newspaper, but didn't have, I guess, the temperament for it because he had, 3 nervous breakdowns?
3 nervous breakdowns. So what did he do? He went into politics and was elected to the United States Senate.
And they ended up switching roles, in a sense.
And they ended up switching roles, and then he served 1 term. He was one of the irreconcilables who opposed the League of Nations under Woodrow Wilson. And he was defeated for re-election and committed suicide, which had been a family secret for decades.
When was that? Does your book reveal it?
1925. Yes, yeah. And Kate Medill...
He took barbiturates, wasn't it?
Yeah, the mother, Kate Medill, who was certifiably off her rocker, used to tell her sons that all the McCormicks wind up insane. Her own husband, there was an extraordinary letter I found. I have to back up and say that I was given access. I was the first person.
That's what I was going to say. You have, in the
access.
summer of 1990, you were approached by the Robert McCormick Tribune Foundation, and you had access to these papers. There were some 100,000?
Hundreds of thousands of papers, diaries, family correspondence. Nothing was withheld. And...
did you know this even existed before they approached you?
No, I knew there was a collection, and I knew it had to be pretty good because it had been sealed for 35 years. And I subsequently learned that a factor in that was the Tribune in the late 80s wanted to unload the New York Daily News. And the last thing they wanted was a book to come out reminding everyone about the crazy colonel at a time when they were trying to make a profit on the unprofitable Daily News. But Kate McCormick, her own husband, Robert Sanderson McCormick, who died in an institution, Kate wrote characteristically one day to Robert that she had the most extraordinary news. And the letter was written in a note of what can only be called triumph. And it said, "Your father has syphilis." And this was good news because this meant there wasn't a curse in the blood, that Bert and his brother were not doomed to wind up in an institution like their father. It was just syphilis. That's the kind of woman that Kate was. She literally is something out of Shakespeare. And she also, having driven her eldest son to the brink of madness, then disowned her younger son. Bert had an affair.
And we should say Bert.
Robert,
the colonel.
yeah, the colonel in embryo. This is before 1910, before he goes off into World War I and earns his title. This is during his political days. He has an affair with Amy Adams, who's 8 years his senior. I'm not a Freudian, but it's pretty clear the colonel went through life looking for a mother. And a scandal ensued.
And who was she married to?
She was married to his cousin, Ed Adams, who was a notorious drunk, and I think probably physically abusive as well. And Kate denounces them, refers to Amy as the old tart. The old tart isn't going to have a stick of her furniture. And just to make sure, she decides to send Bert to Russia. Why Russia? Well, earlier her money had purchased the embassy for her rather ineffectual husband. He was ambassador in Moscow, or St. Petersburg, of course, those days, just as the Tsarist regime was beginning to crumble. So you see, this story spans the globe. I mean,
Yeah.
it is extraordinary how many byways there are.
Well, and just as a brief aside, I mean, you have Joe Medill, his grandfather, helps Abraham Lincoln become president.
That's right. So the colonel is reared with this very elevated sense of what, as the editor, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, is his national role. Presidents come and go every 4 years. Newspapers, that's much more important than a president. And he truly believed that whoever ran the Washington Bureau of the Chicago Tribune had the second most important job in Washington, D.C.
In fact, when Medill, his older brother, leaves the paper because he has his third breakdown, there's no necessarily, they actually have an editor run the paper for a while. And they didn't necessarily immediately jump to the colonel, to Bert,
right.
because a lot of people underestimated him in the early days.
And this was, remember, just coming off of the scandal with Amy Adams. And his mother, she had sent him to Russia, pulled strings, literally with the Tsar, and got him assigned to the Eastern Front, the Russian army. This is before the United States went into the war.
Well, and speaking of Kate, his mother, when he leaves, she thinks she's never going to see him again.
Well, yeah, but she also figures that he's never going to see Amy again. And so this was all designed to break up this romance. Little does she know that a month after he sails for London, Amy sails after him, all by prearrangement. They're married furtively in a registry in London. And of course the word gets back to Kate, who rages like the Furies, disowns him, cuts him out of her will. But she has a problem. She doesn't want to lose the Tribune. She certainly doesn't want to lose the Tribune to her sister or to her nephew. And her other son is unfortunately indisposed. So she doesn't have much choice but to reconcile with her wayward younger son, Bertie. And that's exactly what happens. And eventually, Bertie and his cousin, Joe Patterson, as I say, they make history before Joe goes off to New York. The interesting thing is, for people who think of Colonel McCormick as a fixture on the Chicago scene, he actually he had actually volunteered to go to New York and start the Tribune, the Daily News himself, because the memory of the ostracism that had followed his wedding to Amy was very strong. They were no longer welcome at the Onwensia Club, in Lake Forest, the polo set. And so they went out to Wheaton, to Joe Medill's country home called Red Oaks, which the colonel, after World War I, renamed Cantini in recognition of the only battle in which he fought during World War I as an American artilleryman. Only battle he fought because he became ill. And
I think you said he was there 9 months during the war.
That's right. Didn't want a desk job. He worked with Pershing. Again, here comes General Pershing into
Well,
the
that's the
story.
amazing thing about this
Pershing,
family. These
MacArthur.
people touched all the
You remember the
bases in American
Woody Allen
history.
movie Zelig? You know, Colonel McCormick is Zelig.
Yeah.
I mean, he is, everywhere he is, he's in the midst of history being made. So anyway, he has this remarkable World War I record, first with the Russian army, then with the American army as it's arriving in France.
And he was an artilleryman.
He was an artilleryman. And by all accounts, although his enemies later tried to suggest otherwise, by all accounts, and I had an opportunity to verify this, acquitted himself very well, indeed heroically.
What was the story about the order he disobeyed and by opening fire? He senses that the Germans are coming up on the right flank, and he's not supposed to shoot because apparently the French think the Americans are trigger happy.
That's right. And
So-
the colonel, curious, I mean, the colonel had a military frame of mind, but he was not the sort to take orders. I mean, he had a military frame of mind as long as he could be a five-star general of the armies. You know, I mean, he regarded himself as the greatest military expert since Hannibal. So in that particular case, he was absolutely right in what he did, and indeed later on he was recognized for his insubordination, if you will.
And he basically, he opened fire against orders. And
He opened fire against orders, but in a very timely fashion, contributed to victory. He later received the Distinguished Service Medal, but only because he campaigned for it. And so he comes back after the war, and in the 1920s, it's really when the Tribune takes off. Radio, WGN broadcasts the Scopes Monkey Trial live. WGN is at both political conventions. And remember, we're not talking about networks. We're not talking about NBC or the Columbia Broadcasting System. We're talking about one station in one city. But again, it is all part of the colonel's conscious plan to make Chicago the new New York, to make it a world capital. And the problem with making it a world capital was the 20s was also a period of prohibition, which meant rampant lawlessness, violence in the streets of Chicago. At one point, famously, a Tribune reporter named Jake Lingle was corrupted by the mob. He was shot dead in an underpass not far from Tribune Tower. It was arguably the most embarrassing incident, certainly in the colonel's 40 years with the Tribune, because it also exposed the fact that he had lost touch with his own newsroom. And there was a thoroughgoing investigation, although to this day there's a parlor game as to whether or not someone was railroaded for the murder. But the 20s were, in other ways, the heyday of the Tribune. Big Bill Thompson was mayor of Chicago. The colonel hammered him relentlessly, even though they were in the same political party. The Tribune printed.
And why were they at odds?
Because Big Bill Thompson was a crook, and the colonel was a very worldly man in many ways, and he was willing to deal with Ed Kelly's machine, the Nash machine. I mean, he dealt with machines.
It seems his life was a series of feuds.
Oh, that's right. He needed enemies the way most people need friends. And psychologically he needed them, but also it sold newspapers.
And again, whether it was his family or outsiders, he was constantly in
People
battle.
bought the Tribune to find out who was the colonel at odds with today. And the genius for invective, you know, there was a downstate congressman who ran for the Senate in the 1940s as a Democrat, who was always referred to in the news columns as Small Potatoes McKeough. I mean, Arthur Vandenberg was referred to variously as Judas Iscariot and Benedict Arnold when he betrayed the isolationist cause after the war and became a great internationalist and supporter of many of Harry Truman's programs, like NATO and the Marshall Plan. The Tribune had a great gift for calling names and stirring. It made as much news as it reported, and people wanted to read it. It was exciting. It was colorful. It was fun.
There was a feud with Henry Ford he had.
Henry Ford led to the first trial of the century. I mean, he called Henry Ford an ignorant anarchist, quote unquote, because Ford basically was discouraging enlistments in the National Guard. And Ford sued him, which was the stupidest thing Ford ever did, because first of all, the Tribune put Ford on the stand and demonstrated he may not have been an anarchist, but he, God knows, was ignorant. And it was great publicity. It was free publicity for the Tribune. And so in the end, I actually found notes from one of the jurors, and so was able to piece together for the first time the jury deliberations. And in the end, the jury awarded Ford 6 cents, which the colonel then refused to pay and sue me. But even by that time, even Ford knew when to call it quits.
It's funny because he writes to the Secretary of War about Ford. He goes, "My excuse for writing you is I believe Henry Ford is an unscrupulous, raptious hypocrite, and I think I have his number."
The colonel thought he had a lot of people's number. There's no doubt. I mean, you can look at the colonel, and the colonel can be defined by his enemies, but the colonel can also be defined by his ideals. And in addition to all of the wonderful, colorful feuds that went on, this was a man who was willing to risk everything for the First Amendment. I mean, ironically, the scourge of liberals was the staunchest defender the First Amendment ever had. In the 1920s, there was a notorious little rag in Minnesota, and virtually indefensible. No one wanted to defend it. And the colonel put $1 million of his own money into the defense of a principle. And it's hard to believe, but the case was decided in 1930. And before 1930, the Supreme Court, the nation's courts, had never ruled on the doctrine of prior restraint. And basically the law in Minnesota, what was known as the gag law, said that you could shut down a publication if it printed what was patently offensive. And the colonel said, the more a newspaper is doing its job, the more patently offensive it's going to be to someone, including politicians, especially politicians.
Well, wasn't it Thompson, the mayor, that also sued and tried to shut down
the
newspaper?
Mayor Thompson came up with a novel theory. Basically, Mayor Thompson sued the Tribune, suggesting that its negative coverage of his administration was depressing the city's bond rating.
Yeah.
And he was just cynical enough, and he owned just enough judges to believe, the judiciary was corrupted in Chicago in the 1920s. And so, he didn't get away with it, but he had reason to believe he might get away with it. So anyway, in 1930, by one vote, 5-4, and only because Chief Justice Taft had died and been replaced by Charles Evans Hughes, 5-4, the Supreme Court ruled against the doctrine of prior restraint. So when you look at the Pentagon Papers, when you look at all of these later cases that are held up, quite understandably, in the history of American journalism as landmark cases defining the rights of the press, they are all superseded and preceded by the Minnesota v. Neer case, which was Colonel McCormick's doing.
I was complimenting you just before we started because the book, The Colonel, is not just a story of Robert McCormick's life. It is a history in many ways of journalism and the interceding of these theories. What, as a historian, is that explain to me the value when you take on a project like this? What is it you look for and how do you approach it when someone hands you the opportunity to look at someone's life as Robert McCormick and says, here's the papers that document it?
There are very few lives that are as multifaceted, as colorful, as historically surprising, as dramatic or gripping on as many levels as this life. Ironically, the colonel has been caricatured for most of his lifetime and in the years since. He lent himself to that. I think part of that was the price he paid. He was a shy man, and he created this persona called the Colonel. But it was also a very shrewd business move, because he made this reputation of a slightly crazed, definitely unpredictable character work for him. And he was eccentric, there's no doubt about it. He was 6'5". He sat behind an Italian marble desk on a raised platform with a Gothic window over his shoulder. And you sat there looking up into the face of God. And then when you tried to leave the office, you'd bang into the wall. There was no door. Well, there was a buzzer on his desk and a sliding door. I mean, straight out of Hollywood. It was all very theatrical, and that's the point. The Colonel staged his own life. He said, "I was determined to lead a great life, an exotic life," and he scripted it. But he did it from a distance. He was a shy man. He was an innovator in many, many ways. I've talked about aviation already. Fashion. He loved the color pink. He's probably the only business executive in the 1920s who wore pink shirts to the office. He wanted, actually, once he wanted to print the Tribune on pink newsprint, but he thought people might mistake it on the stands for the Police Gazette. He wore Bermuda shorts to work, elegantly tailored, Savile Row Bermuda shorts in the Chicago summer. Makes perfect sense, you know. He had the idea when he built Tribune Tower, why don't we build parking ramps? Let's put parking ramps underneath these skyscrapers. Well, you know, it was an idea ahead of its time. He thought milk bottles, glass milk bottles, were a terrible waste of time. Why don't we redesign milk bottles and make them in paper, you know, cardboard milk containers? Well, he was ahead of his time. In the 1940s, he pioneered in a very primitive form of fax technology. He wanted to print the newspaper in color. 50 years before USA Today, he experimented in a full-color Chicago Tribune. And the only reason he wasn't able to go ahead with it was because, particularly in the Depression, advertisers did not want to pay the extra cost of full-color printing. But in many ways, I mean, he was a man ahead of his time. At the same time, the popular notion was, the wag said he had the greatest mind of the 14th century. And he was both. So to a biographer approaching him, he's like a diamond. There are so many faces to this man, and so many careers came together. I mean, he was a journalist, he was a politician, he was a civic leader, he was an outdoorsman, a great explorer, Arctic explorer as a young man. He created 3 communities in Canada. In fact, when the New Deal became insufferable, he decided to create his own country outside the United States, and he did it in Quebec and in Ontario. He created 3, planned communities, and he built paper mills, which allowed the Tribune to get a jump on all of its competitors because it printed its own paper. It would no longer be at the beck and call of paper companies. He was a great businessman. He certainly was a great controversialist. He was a decidedly self-taught historian of the Civil War, wrote 2 books on Grant, insisted that Grant didn't drink, or that his drinking was greatly exaggerated. He lived what he said he set out to live, a great exotic life. And it was a life that had never been explored because the caricature was so strong. There was a cartoon in the Sun-Times, a running character called Colonel McCormick. And it was all part of this. And of course, the Sun-Times didn't know what they were doing was they were feeding the legend. They were helping the competition. They were selling newspapers because the colonel, as I say, had an opinion on everything, how to run the war. He didn't want to fight any war, but once we got into a war, he was not bashful about telling the president or the secretary of war how to win the war. And so the Sun-Times created this wonderful running character called Colonel McCormick, who had crossed the Delaware with Washington and who had fought at Gettysburg and basically knew everything about war. And the colonel loved it. I mean, he understood that there was no such thing as bad publicity.
To what extent, when you have a period of time, perhaps that we are now in, where one of the phrases to get along, go along, McCormick was the opposite of that.
Yeah.
He wanted to live life exactly on his terms. Yeah. When you look at lives as a historian, to what extent is that somewhat of a theme, or is that overstating it?
No, I mean, certainly those lives are much more interesting than the lives that are lived in accommodation to whatever is the prevailing mode of thought. The colonel was a great individualist. He was a rugged individualist. But he was just such a colorful character. And I thought, over time, I also found him to be, a very poignant man, a lonely man, a man who I don't think ever really found love. He had 2 marriages, neither of which was particularly successful. I think he decided early on, quite deliberately, that his own childhood had been so miserable that he wasn't going to bring children into the world.
Well, he wasn't sure that he wasn't passing on the insanity.
Precisely, and that's another thing that was always in the background. So the Tribune became his family. On Christmas Eve, you could find the Colonel in tuxedo in the printing press, walking up and down the row, shaking hands with the men who were his family. And again, it's another one of the paradoxes of this man who despised paternalism at the state level, that he ran the most paternalistic company in America. I mean, in the 19-teens and 20s, the Tribune's health plan, free dental care, everyone who got married at the Tribune was presented personally by the Colonel with a chest of silver. I mean, it was extraordinary. No one lost their job in the war. If you went off and you fought, then when you came back, you had a job at least as good as the one you left. But the Colonel could afford to do that. It was a different economic climate, and basically it was a family-owned business.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.